Okay, continuing on with chapter 4. John is on his way to school now. John had the bad habit of chewing things when he wasn't thinking hard. When he was thinking hard. This morning, he had several things to think about. What had made the toothpaste taste like chocolate? What had made the orange juice taste like chocolate? What had made the bacon and egg taste like chocolate? What had made the toast and butter and marmalade taste like chocolate? Each one of these things had felt the way it had always felt before. The toothpaste had been soft and pasty. The bacon had been hot, crispy, and oily. The toast had been crunchy, and the marmalade sticky and lumpy. But everything had tasted like the chocolate he had eaten in bed last night. John pulled a gloved thumb in his mouth and thoughtfully chewed. His mother had frequently pointed out to him that chewing his gloves made little holes that let in the cold air, but he chewed them just the same when he was thinking hard. This time, he noticed something very odd about the thumb of his glove. Instead of tasting leathery, it tasted like chocolate. John pulled his thumb out of his mouth. The part of the glove that had been in his mouth was now brown, instead of black like the rest. He bit the end of the leather thumb again. It came right off in his mouth, leaving his own thumb bare. John chewed, and it was like chewing leather made of chocolate, leather that melted like chocolate. In a second or two, he had swallowed it. The gloves were not new. John had had them quite a while. He couldn't understand why he had never thought of eating them before. He tried to tear off one of the fingers, but the leather was too strong for him. He put it into his mouth, and it immediately turned into chocolate. Then he was able to break it off easily. He popped it into his mouth and chewed it up and swallowed it. It was delicious. Walking along, devouring his gloves, John did not notice one of his schoolfellows, Spider Wilson, until he heard his voice. "John's gone crazy! John's gone crazy!" Spider yelled. Then he turned to John. "Don't they feed you where you live?" he sneered. Spider was in the grade just above John's and was one of the meanest and slyest boys in the whole school. John gulped down hard a large piece of his second glove palm and looked pleased. "What's the matter?" Spider demanded. "Do your people make you eat leather?" "This is special leather," John replied. He licked his lips and sighed contentedly. "It turns into chocolate as soon as you put it into your mouth. Look!" John bit off the glove's little finger and took it out of his mouth. "Now it's chocolate." He put it back into his mouth and gulped it down. "Give me a piece," Spider said. "Why should I?" John wanted to know. "They're my gloves." "Hand over a piece," Spider said. "Do I eat your gloves?" John asked reasonably, his mouth full of chocolate. "Why should you eat mine?" "Those aren't real gloves," Spider said. "Whenever one person has candy, he has to share it with the others. That's the club rule." "What club?" John asked. "Never mind what club," Spider said, "but you better let me have some of that chocolate." Without waiting longer, Spider snatched what was left of the second glove. John was too surprised to resist, and he didn't want to anyhow. He had a feeling that he'd had enough chocolate for a while. He was getting a bit thirsty. Spider ran only a little way ahead. When he saw that John wasn't going to fight to get the glove back, he started to eat his prize. He stuffed the leather into his mouth and took a big bite. Spider stopped short in his tracks. He frowned and bit deep into the leather again. Disgusting. It tasted worse than just leather. It tasted like leather with which a boy had made mud pies and snowballs and patted old dogs. John thought perhaps he might be getting late for school, so he started running. He left Spider Wilson spitting the soggy remains of the glove into the gutter. Still giggling to himself about the defeat of the enemy, John walked between the great stone pillars at the entrance of the school grounds. He had gone no more than halfway to the main building when he heard Susan Buttercup calling him. She was standing near the jungle gym with some of her friends. "I've got something to show you, John," she shouted. As she came running to meet him, he could see that she was waving something in her hand that flashed as it caught the rays of the sun. It was a silver dollar. "It's a birthday present," she explained, showing him the dollar. "Isn't it beautiful?" The sight of such wealth made John forget the triumphs of his own day. "It's a good present," he said. "Are you sure it's made of silver, though?" I once got a whole bag of gold coins in a Christmas stocking, only they were chocolate coins covered with gold paper. Of course it's real, silly, Susan said. My daddy said, you can feel it if you don't believe me. She handed him the coin. John looked at the coin suspiciously. All right, said Susan, bite it if you think it isn't real. Go on, bite it. It's kind of something people used to do to test to see if a coin was real. John felt rather silly. I can see it's real now, he said. I don't have to bite it. But I want you to, Susan insisted. You weren't sure. We'll make sure. That's what they always do on television. When a cowboy wants to make sure a dollar's real, he bites it. John put the dollar about halfway into his mouth and reluctantly bit it. His teeth went right through the coin. The part that had passed between his lips was hard, but sweet chocolate. Susan could hardly believe her eyes. She had given John a complete circle of silver. He, sadly, handed back a crescent. John didn't know what to say. Susan couldn't speak. Tears trickled down her cheeks like rain down a window pane. She looked at the piece of dollar in her hand. She looked up at John, whose face was red with embarrassment. John Midas, Susan blurted out at last. I hate you. She turned and ran away before John could think of anything at all to say. Chapter 5. And at the beginning of chapter 5, there's a picture of like a little math assignment. John hung up his coat, got his notebook and pencil out of his locker, and sat down at his small table just in time for the second bell when Mrs. Plimsoll walked silently into the classroom. As soon as she appeared in the doorway, all the chattering and scuffling stopped. The 20 boys and girls sat straight in their chairs and looked straight ahead at the clean blackboard. Good morning, children, Mrs. Plimsoll said. Good morning, Mrs. Plimsoll, the class answered respectfully. Mrs. Plimsoll sat at her high desk, blinking her eyes as she surveyed the room. Then she opened a little drawer in her desk and pulled out a spectacles case from which she took her reading glasses. She removed her long-distance glasses, put on her short-distance glasses, snapped shut the spectacles case, replaced it into the drawer, shut the drawer, tilted her head forward so that she could look over the glasses on her nose, and said, This morning, children, we are going to have an important test. There were some groans and a few oohs and ahs. Mrs. Plimsoll lifted up one of her hands, and silence was restored instantly. No complaining, please, she said sternly. This test will show me how well you have been learning your arithmetic this year. It will be a short one. I am going to write just 4 problems on the board. I shall expect you to solve them all swiftly and accurately, and to write your answers neatly. You will place your paper in front of you now. You will write your name at the top right-hand corner, and then you will place your pencil beside your paper. Sit back in your chair and wait till I give the signal to begin work. Mrs. Plimsoll turned to the blackboard and began chalking up the test problems. Tests always made John nervous. Besides, his lips were feeling dry and the taste of chocolate was strong in his mouth. He raised his hand. Yes, John? Mrs. Plimsoll asked. May I go and get a drink of water, please, Mrs. Plimsoll? He asked in a small voice. Very well, hurry back. We're going to start in a few minutes. John gratefully slipped out of the room and walked quickly down the quiet corridor to a water fountain. His tongue felt thick with chocolate. The cold water would be refreshing. He pressed his foot down on the fountain treadle, and a stream of clear ice-cold water spurted up from the silver nozzle in the white enamel basin. He lowered his head until the jet of water reached his lips. The cold water splashed delightfully against the outside of his mouth. He opened his lips. As soon as the water gushed in, it turned to ice-cold chocolate water, thin and sweet. Quickly, stopping the flow, John looked with dismay at the shallow puddle that had formed and was now draining away into the basin of the water fountain. He hurried to another fountain on the second floor of the building. But there the same thing happened. The clear ice-cold water turned to liquid chocolate in his mouth. When John finally got back to his classroom, all his other pupils were bent over their tables, busily scratching away. Mrs. Plimsoll looked up from her book as John tiptoed in. She looked at the clock on the wall, looked back at him, and wagged her finger disapprovingly. John began on the first of the 4 problems, but he was so worried about the chocolate water that he couldn't keep his mind on his work. By the time he was ready to start the 4th problem, The other boys and girls were already putting down their pencils and straightening up and smiling at each other. 2 minutes to go, said Mrs. Plimsoll. Concentrating hard, John took the end of his pencil between his teeth and began to nibble it. It immediately turned into chocolate. Then he noticed an even more disturbing change. Although he had taken the pencil out of his mouth, as soon as the first piece of chocolate had crumbled off, the pencil was continuing to change to chocolate. The chocolate was slowly but steadily moving down the pencil, replacing the wood and the lead inside, changing it into a chocolate pencil before John's very eyes. The magic, for John now knew that his power must be magic, was apparently getting stronger. By the time the whole pencil had changed from red, yellow, and black to dark brown, Mrs. Plimsoll was announcing that only a few seconds remained in which to write down the final answer. Do you see those math problems on the board they had to do? Yikes. Just a minute, John pleaded. Shh, Mrs. Plimsoll cautioned him, holding a finger up to her mouth. Shh, chorused the slow workers, who were becoming almost as excited as John. But John felt worst of all. He felt sure that he could finish the problem and write down the correct answer if only he had something to write with. But Mrs. Plimsoll, he begged in a loud whisper, my pencil's turned to chocolate. Hush, John, Mrs. Plimsoll said. I'll speak to you after the bell. John tried to write with his changed pencil, but the point was too soft, and he only succeeded in making a chocolate smear where there should have been written a 72. Chapter 6.